Well, welcome everyone to today's show. It's great to have you, and personally, I'm very excited to do this live session. As Sam mentioned, it's a different format from our normal show, but I think it's great. We've done one of these before, and it usually ends up being very engaging type of conversation. What's also different about today's session is that normally when we do the recorded versions, we have one guest on the show. As you can see today, we are lucky to have 3 guests, and that will make this whole session even more interactive and entertaining for sure. And I'm super excited by the panel that we've managed to bring together here. 3 extremely experienced guests. I'll just introduce them very briefly, and then I'll let them talk a bit more about their own backgrounds. But first off, we have Anita Lettink with us. Anita is HR and payroll technology advisor, and she is also an author of a book that's standing behind her, which is called How to Select Your Next Payroll. And she's very active on social media, so I'm sure many of you have probably already crossed paths with her. And if you're not following her yet, I'm sure after today's session you will. Next, we have Thomas Otter with us today. Thomas has had many different roles in the broader HRTech industry. He's worked as a consultant, as an analyst, as a senior executive, as an entrepreneur, and currently he is working as a venture capitalist at a venture capital firm called Acadian Ventures. And I think he's probably one of the most respected voices in the global HR and payroll space. So we're very excited to have Thomas on the call today. And last but not least, Trevor Townsend, my esteemed co-founder, who has had a long career, over 20 years in the HR and payroll space. He started when he was 15 years old, and he doesn't look a day older than 35. That's what I always like to say. With this cast of heavy hitters on our call today, we are naturally going to tackle a very big topic. So what we want to talk about is trends in the payroll industry. So it's a very big topic. And we want to talk a little bit about trends from the past. What have we seen? How's the payroll industry evolved over the last few years? And then we also want to get into what's the future hold. Where do we think this is all taking us? And take a look forward. So with that, let's get maybe started with just a quick round of introductions, and we'll go ladies first. Anita, if you want to say a few things about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anita Lettink. Thank you for the nice introduction, Mark. I have been working in the HR and payroll space for over 20 years. And like you mentioned, last year I decided to write a book because so much went wrong in payroll go lives that I couldn't sit by and watch that happen. And I think a lot about the future of work and how payroll and HR tie into that. And that is also why I'm active on social media, because I think that there is a lot that we can do to make it work better. And so I hope that through my posts, I inspire people to take some action.
Excellent, fantastic. Great to have you on, Anita. Thomas, you want to go next?
Yeah, if you like, yeah. It's cool to be on a show with Anita. I've known Anita for years, so it's great to be talking with her again. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so like you said, I've been involved in the HRTech space in various roles for about 30 years now. Probably a couple of highlights there. I was at Gartner, led a lot of the HRTech research at Gartner, and then I moved to SuccessFactors, where I eventually became head of product. I was also responsible for a significant period of time for the payroll products at SAP. And about a year ago, I became a venture capitalist, and our goal is to invest into the next wave of HRTech and future work companies. That's what I spend my time doing now, is looking for potential disruptors, the companies that are going to be the unicorns or decacorns or whatever type of corns they are in the next decade or so. Those are the ones that I'm now scouring the world for.
Fantastic. Yeah, very, very interesting, path you've taken throughout your career, and sure will add tremendously to the conversation. Trevor, quick background about yourself.
Delighted to be here today in a very esteemed company. So hopefully I'll do a little bit more than make up the numbers. Started off building HR technology in the early 2000s with a UK-based company called One Click HR. Moved into the payroll area as part of an acquisition. ADP bought that company I worked in years ago. We had great fun there. Enjoyed my move into ADP, where I met Mark, and Mark hatched this idea about Payzaar with me. So I got stuck in, sleeves rolled up, and got executing. So looking forward to this discussion today.
Excellent, fantastic. So let's dive in. What I first want to talk a bit about is what has been happening over the last few years, and what's gotten us to where we are today. Obviously, we've come through a very interesting last 2 or 3 years, and it looks like we're finally coming out of the woodworks and leaving the pandemic behind us. But I think it is interesting to look back and reflect a bit on what's happened and what are some of the takeaways. What impact has the pandemic had on payroll? And I'd love to hear your opinion. So maybe Anita, if you want to get us started on your thoughts on global pandemic and how that sort of influenced and impacted what's been going on in the payroll world.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone, and we both agreed that the pandemic is sort of over here, right? People are back in session, shaking hands, standing very close to each other, and it seems like we're back to what we did before, where in fact a lot has changed. And I think that when we look at the payroll space, a huge amount of change has been happening, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes very obvious. But the landscape in payroll vendors has definitely been shaken up by a number of these global workforce providers that maybe existed in a small form, but during the pandemic really took center stage, large funding rounds. You saw some of the incumbents figure out what was happening and shifting in ideas and potentially also contract. But I think when I look back, what the main difference between before and after is flexibility. Before, when companies would contract for payroll, it was very much, this is the model, this is how we do this, and this is what you buy. And now it is very much a model where companies actively think with their customers about what is it actually that you need. And we can provide A, B, and C, but we can also combine it in a number of models. And then there's companies like yourself, have a Payzaar that can tie it all together, which did exist, but it wasn't actually being used that much. So that flexibility in technologies and service levels, and then for companies to be able to tie that all together and have an integrated or holistic way to look at what their payroll is actually doing underneath that layer is something that is very, very different from before to now.
Yeah, we certainly think so. And, obviously we've been part of blazing that trail for the industry and creating something that's a bit bit different and more agile, as you said, and I think more adaptable than maybe some of the traditional models. Yeah, and I think the pandemic has forced a lot of organizations to become a bit more, think out of the box. And
Yeah.
Think how to get things done through new means. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. Thomas, what are your thoughts on the pandemic and payroll? What has it done how has it helped to reshape payroll, or has it, I suppose?
Well, in some ways, I think, quite early on, I think there were some quite interesting dynamics with payroll. So if you look at how payroll departments had to react, early on in the pandemic, there were a lot of country-specific changes to payroll that were driven by the pandemic, tax breaks and allowances and recalculations of how pay would work, and furlongs and all that kind of stuff. So I think payroll departments were put under a tremendous amount of pressure early on in the pandemic, having to work remotely, and I think many of them were tested, because I think many of the older payrolls were not really set up for never mind remote work from the workforce, they weren't really set up and engineered for remote work for the payroll administrator. So, I think that was super challenging for many organizations. And I think many organizations realized, quite how aging and challenged their payroll technologies were, and that, opened up to sort of rethinking new ways of deploying payroll. But I think that first period of COVID really, it made people realize how important payroll was, in the sense that there were all these fundamental changes going on with payroll in terms of the managing the furlong. Many countries it was a furlong process or some form of government. The payroll really became the lifeline, or the distribution for money from government to citizens in the context of the early stages of lockdown and so on. And I think that was pretty important. The second thing that I would say that COVID accelerated was the acceptance and understanding of the value of remote work. Remote work, I think, was tolerated in various organizations, and there were a few exceptions, which were organizations that were remote first. But the idea that you could work remotely and be highly productive was considered a bit weird. And what we learned in COVID is that it is actually possible, and it can work quite well to work remotely or in a hybrid form. So yeah, I think that helped drive the the rapid adoption, especially in software companies of hey, our engineers in Bulgaria, but it doesn't really matter. We've got half our team is in Berlin, the other half our team's in Munich. We've got people here, we've got people there, and that sort of became much more accepted and much more comfortable for organizations. I think there's still many challenges with it, and many organizations, there's some cases, some industries have a pushback towards going back to the office, but I don't think we'll ever be the same. I think organizations will be more and more comfortable with this idea that at least a portion of the workforce works remotely, and a portion of the workforce will work in the office, and there'll be a mixture. And this again, creates, I think, some challenges for payroll in terms of, are your payroll people themselves remote, and also, drives, as Anita mentioned, the need for, more flexibility in terms and conditions, which again, places pressure on the payroll technology itself to be more flexible. And then what I'd say finally is we started to see, and I'm going rambling on here, but I think we've just started to see the coming together of fintech and HRTech. And I think the early evidence of that is the sort of advanced wage type plays. But I think we're really just at the start of the opportunities for synergies between payroll tech and fintech. But we're just at the start of that journey, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting intersection. I do want to come back to that point actually in a moment, because I think it is a interesting emerging trend as well. Trevor, any thoughts from your side?
Sure. I think both Thomas and Anita touched on agility and mobility. So, 100%, when I'm looking for a car parking space on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, it's much more difficult to find us than on a Thursday or Friday, because I think we're just seeing how people now have worked, and some form of hybrid remote working is just a fact of life. And I think that, like as Thomas says, that places a strain on the payroll teams to be able to keep up, because where I want to work, how I want to work, the terms and conditions to support that. The smaller organizations that suddenly became multinational overnight because they became de facto employers in countries that they never had operations previously, and that's just, I suppose, part of a new way of working that happened by accident, but is kind of here to stay, I think, as part of the implications of a post-pandemic world. But there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about just for a moment, I suppose, and it's what we're seeing in the economy just generally. And when you go somewhere and you're out for dinner, and there's a little sign up outside a restaurant saying, "Hey, we've a reduced menu, we're doing our best, service is lower." There's been somewhat of a rebalancing, I think, in terms of how people want to work, and what that kind of means, and the kind of work that people want to do. So there's certain kind of dimensions, especially we see very visible signs of it in the service industry, where people maybe aren't willing to work in the same ways they were previously for the same terms and conditions, and we're seeing inflation, right? And part of that is energy driven, but I think part of that is people picking and choosing the kind of jobs they want to do a little bit more. And when we kind of think about that then, and we think about the payroll industry, and I think Thomas kind of touched on it, that no one was really thinking about how payroll was working pre-pandemic, which is kind of endemic of something that, if it's not noisy, if it's not broken, we're going to ignore it. But I think people in the payroll industry really carried an awful lot of, I suppose, the forefront of making sure people got paid, and furlough schemes and various government supports got implemented and helped, millions of people around the world through the pandemic, which is great. But just linking it back to this kind of rebalancing of how people want to work, I think people in the payroll industry want to work better and smarter. I think they also want to work flexibly as well. And we're seeing things, and I'm seeing it all the time, and when we're out talking to customers and people in the industry, just general shortages of skills, and people leaving the industry a little bit as well. And I think that kind of wider kind of societal or economic rebalancing of people's priorities is certainly making itself felt in payroll. So I suppose, what does that then mean? And I think we'll get into that over the course of the discussion in terms of how can technology make the lives of people working in the payroll industry, consumers of payroll services, people delivering payroll services to customers, how can technology make that a little bit better? There's one little point that I also saw as well, and I think this is a really nice initiative that our friends over the Global Payroll Association is doing. They're driving the whole campaign around payroll is a career. And I think that's something that I've noticed since the pandemic. And I think it's also linked back to maybe some of those things are in shortages, and how people are rebalancing their priorities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So lots of things that are going on, right? So at macro socio-economic level, the burden being placed on the payroll teams, and having to grapple with being thrown into the middle of a crisis, right? And trying to figure out how to handle that with the means that they've been given, and the increased complexity that emerged through, as Thomas said, lots of legislation being introduced during that time period. And at the same time, sort of the way people are used to working, want to work, and balance life and work has to introduce additional complexities and challenges as well. So let's talk about then what kind of role has technology started to play during this time to help overcome some of these complexities and some of these challenges. Are there some specific ways how you see that technology has stepped up or come to the call of how to help payroll become more effective, more efficient. So maybe we'll start this one with Thomas, and then go with Trevor next.
Yeah, I think this is going on at a number of levels, and I could pick up 50 different things to talk about how technology is changing in payroll, but I'll probably pick up one where I think we've seen significant improvements. I'm on the board of Emita's Irish global payroll player, and I've been involved with several other payroll companies over the last couple of years, and I'd say one of the things that's getting better is the connectivity between the systems that feed into payroll. So the API layer, the integration layers between HR systems and payrolls have got a lot better, and the management of the service layer between the systems that feed into payroll and the payroll engine itself, there have been significant improvements in the technologies that support that process, whether it's at the basic middleware level or whether it's at applications. At the application level itself. I think there's been a rapid improvement of those capabilities. So, enabling, and there are a number of vendors that have done this, but enable you to move information safely and securely from your HR system into payrolls, and the aggregation of that information, the enhancement or the improvement of that information before it moves into payroll. The technologies and the processes around that, I think, across the board, we've seen a massive improvement in that area. We've seen improvements, I think, also in the integration to government reporting. On the outside of payroll, I think that's been improvements there, and we've seen improvements, I think, in error monitoring and the first applications, I think, of some of the AI technologies in terms of monitoring payroll processes, and a little bit of lightweight process automation on top of payroll, on top of payroll as well. There's a couple that I just pick up on, but I could ramble on this all day. So maybe Anita, you want to jump into?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we go to Anita next?
Sure. Maybe let me add what I'm missing at the moment. Maybe that completes the picture, because even though I see some new engines come to the market, I think where we really need innovation to happen is in the payroll engine itself.
Exactly.
And the reason for that is that we're moving, or we have already moved, to an on-demand world where people want to have access to their money the moment that they have completed whatever assignment they are on. And currently, companies are bridging that gap with earned wage access solutions, but that's a little bit of a stopgap, and it does not always work for companies because, for financial reasons. What you would potentially like is a payroll engine that continuously calculates your salary or your wages the moment that you have worked, when there is a change, so that you don't have this big run at the end of the payroll period. This also helps the payroll administrator, right? When payroll is always right, and when someone then says, we need to pay, then you can push the button and push it out, and payments are being made. That is not the case now in many situations. You have to do an initial run, and you have to check it, and then you do the final run. And so all that work in 1 week, instead of gradual changes and updates. And so it's always on. I think there is potential to disrupt the industry. There is also where I see this interface to fintech that Thomas was talking about happening. So I do see some improvements, but it could be much more. And I think the first company that comes to the market with a payroll engine that is based on new principles, new technologies, but that can also cover more than one country, is going to be hugely popular.
So this ability to then, it sounds like what you're talking about is having technology capabilities to kind of process payroll on demand, right?
Yeah.
Instead of waiting and saying that's a very sequential process. I first gather all my inputs, and then I'm going to run my calculation. I'm going to go through my validation. I'm going to check everything, and then I'm going to release information to employees and get them paid. It's basically sort of, you're talking about a more fluid ongoing cycle.
Because one of the things that you can do then is you can you can push the results to your employees, to your workers, and say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to pay you this. Yeah. Is this in line with your expectations? And that's a different way of bringing the employee or the worker into your payroll process, because they have an interest.
Yeah.
I get it. Being correct.
And I can totally see how, from an employee being paid perspective, that becomes incredibly powerful and appealing. I'm just trying to picture, as a payroll professional, right, that's kind of used to, hey, it's the month beginning. This is where I'm collecting all my inputs. It's going to turn that sort of whole traditional way of, organizing your work. Forget about the technology for a minute, right? Can we have payroll engines that can actually work in this very dynamic way? But even from the people it's still a people-driven function, right? Even with all the technology innovation we're talking about, someone still has to manage the process. So I think, to me, it sounds very, very, very exciting, but also very disruptive in kind of a process, how I organize my work. But it's an interesting model to think about, right? For sure.
Yeah, I think building on that, also what will happen is as you get to the situation where the payroll is always running, the role of the payroll administrator is far less on like running the process, but is on error prediction and on issue resolution, rather than on running running the steps of a process, because the process will be constantly running, and where the payroll expert comes in is to handle the anomalies and pick up and model out the legal changes and do predictions and so on. And what hopefully will happen is that we can get to the situation where the payroll data is real-time accurate, so that it can also help drive business decisions. Because for many organizations, payroll is your biggest impact on cash flow. And being able to understand exactly how your payroll cash demands are going to be, and be able to work more real time with finance, is going to be super interesting and super exciting. And I think there'll be all sorts of new evolutions in terms of how payroll is financed. I've seen some super startups looking at how you actually structure the models of paying for payroll. When you can do real-time global bank transfers, when you can do and when you have to spread out employee payments over the month, rather than having it all at the end of the month. What does this actually do for the cash flow management of your business? And I think there will be some quite sophisticated models to help you manage the cash implications of payroll. Again, that starts to get very, very interesting, very interesting too.
I think it's a point you made early on, Thomas, in terms of the connectivity. Like, data is the key, right? So at the moment, if you take a look at the average organization, they have a plethora of source systems that are not connected, and an awful lot of the work that's done today is trying to knife and fork that data together into a format that can be consumed by the payroll engine that they have in-house, or by a third-party payroll provider that they're working with. So I think there's huge amount of saving for the payroll professionals today start the automation in that area and data collection about, checking out the tolerances of those changes. That communication flow then to make sure the accuracy of payroll, and again, bringing automation to all of that to eliminate the industry of checking that's going on, this data preparation labor, the industry of checking like that. If you look at any of the things around lean or anything like that, over processing, over checking, it's just there has to be ways of eliminating that. Although I think there's certainly options in the market that'll be a stepstone to that future place. It's a complex ecosystem though, right? Because what you have in the organization is you have a target payroll engine, but it needs to be connected to a bunch of different source systems, and the organization is constantly moving itself. So anything that you put in play for the future to help alleviate some of these problems needs to be pluggable and playable with a whole bunch of source systems so that the organization can scale, can acquire, can divest quite quickly without interrupting that continuous kind of calculation of payroll that Anita speaks about. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to get the data to payroll. And then in terms of the connectivity of getting data from payroll to other systems that need to consume that as well. I think maybe some of the connections there are fewer systems that need to consume that payroll data. But I think there's an industry challenge here that I think providers in the payroll space need to look at, but then providers that are adjacent to us as well, right? Because I think a lot of the reasons why we have like a disconnected world is because when I'm designing a HR talent system, I'm thinking about it with a HR talent headset, and I design a super solution for that. And, it might house 50-60% of my data. And then I have a time system that doesn't really talk very well to the HR system and, generates data in a particular way that might not necessarily talk to the payroll system. And the payroll philosophy is, hey, everything's got to be right 100% all of the time. So you got to give me this data in my format. So resolving these, the philosophies that design these systems in the middle is going to be an interesting industry challenge. And I wonder, they haven't, bounced this one around a little bit, but I remember traveling years ago with my cell phone, and if I was going to the US or somewhere like that, I needed to have a triband, right? So maybe there's some sort of standards here that we need to get together and work on.
Well, good luck with that.
Exactly, because all of the market participants have different positions, right?
Sure, but I mean, there are different requirements.
Yeah.
So this is one of the challenges: is the data you capture in a talent management system. If you spell my name wrong, it doesn't really matter. But you don't want to put the problem with payroll data is it has to be 100% accurate, and there's also the efforts of the more validation you build into a system, the more you tie it down and make it and remove flexibility. So you find that when you design systems for payroll, they tend to be focused on accuracy rather than usability, and so there's a tension between data accuracy and usability. And I think some of the things where I've been talking a little bit lately about generative AI and chat GPT and GPT-3 and so on. And I'm very excited about the opportunities for open AI and its alternatives. But I'm not particularly bowled away by chat GPT. I think it's a nice use case. It's a useful tool. It's a test bed, but I'm not sort of thrilled with that, or overly excited about that. But I am excited about the potential for large scale language model to be applied to things like payroll. I think we're still in early days for this, but just hypothetically, if you give me 10 years of pay slips, right, and you give me a rules, you give me a smart AI set, why can it not backwardly derive from that the rules that those pay slips were calculated by? So I think there are opportunities to apply machine learning in new and novel ways to the payroll question, which we've not even yet looked at. So, for instance, one which excites me is the idea of being, one of the problems in product management of payroll is actually in just analyzing the legislation in the first place to understand whether there's an impact on the payroll, right? And to do that in the past as a payroll vendor, you would have to have, people in country that really, really knew the laws and like had friends in the tax office who could say, hey, can you explain this to me? Da, 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 da. And if you start to think about it, get to a point where we can effectively decompose regulation into summaries and into codable concepts. We can use these technologies to help interpret and turn the legislation from legislative words into a programmable concept. And this is one of the big stumbling blocks for payroll, is taking from a compliance concept that's been written in legislation and turning it into a programmable concept. And I think the opportunity to apply some of these technologies, I don't think it will do it. It will automate it completely, but it will be able to do a lot of groundwork and a lot of identification work to speed that process up and make it simpler, and perhaps lower the barriers to entry for payroll globalization. So I think we've not touched machine learning yet really in the payroll context, and I think the opportunities there are going to be very significant to disrupt all kinds of parts of payroll that we've probably not thought about as being disruptable.
So just on these different concepts, then machine learning and AI, and we talked about sort of the connectivity, opportunities to automate the data flows through the end-to-end process, making the whole process, as Anita was talking about, more flexible and adaptable, right, in real time, for the employee experience. So lots of very interesting concepts that are being explored out there. I'm just curious in terms of what you're seeing, let's say over the next 9 to 12 to 18 months. Do you see any of these already coming to fruition? What's kind of closest? What's kind of the, if I'm sitting here in a payroll function, I'm thinking, what should I be thinking about and, prepping my organization for? Which of those various different things that we started to scratch on here do you think are the closest to becoming real, commercial solutions that someone can actually go out and say, I want this, and I'm going to stick it into my payroll environment?
Anita, do you want to have a go, or shall I have a go? No, I've talked enough. You go.
I'll go first.
You go to Trevor to start with.
Yeah. So I'll go first, and then you can let me know what you think, Thomas, and Trevor, of course, as well. I think that most of the payroll vendors have, let's say, at least touched or cracked the surface on the robotic process automation. That has been within the payroll space for probably 5, maybe even 10 years, a long time, especially with regards to operations. So when something happens, this should follow. Those types of, I would say, fairly easy sequences that you can actually break down and that you can feed into RPA and say, okay, if this happens, then you need to take this action, and then you need to complete the payroll. What hasn't happened so much is, or we're just starting to bring some AI and machine learning in there. And that isn't really necessarily bad, because I think we're all just starting to understand what that could mean. And like I mentioned, a lot of the vendors use payroll engines that have existed for 5, 10, 15 years. And if you run for much longer, absolutely, there's even some that still run on mainframes. And with payroll, usually it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because there's always a risk if you switch. Yeah. And is this really the moment that you have time and money to do so? So typically companies wait until the end of the contract, or they wait until there's a burning platform, because there's always issues when you switch, and no one wants to really sign on the dotted line knowing that they're going into a somewhat painful project that might also be a little bit more expensive and take a little bit longer than you think going into it.
Yeah.
What I do think, though, is that behind the scenes, there are companies working on these new payroll engines. They have not come to market, but almost all of them use new technology extensively, and they can, because if you introduce something today, you're a first mover on new technology. And in 10 years' time, they will be somewhat older and traditional, but the new companies that are currently figuring out what they can disrupt in payroll, without fail, look at machine learning and artificial intelligence to figure out what they can do. And the example that Thomas just mentioned, can you take 10 pay slips and feed it to a machine and say, hey, tell me what the rules are here. What should I put in the engine? Or better, you put it in the engine when you're done figuring out whatever it is something that they're all trying to solve, but I have not seen one that really has solved that. And that comes from the fact that you can easily solve this for white collar workers who earn a monthly salary, and the payment is about the same every month, but that is not where the issue is. The issue is with, let me call them blue collar workers, with overtime, with time calculated based on hours worked, with percentages for times that they work, like on Sunday, they get 150. And so that is where the problem usually is with payroll.
Shifts across midnight and all those glorious
exactly
things. Yeah.
And 6 hours on one day and 3 hours on the next, and is that then still legal? So that is the issue in payroll.
So when we're talking to the industry, I keep coming back to real blocking and tackling type issues, right? And it's like, how do I get my data? I spend too much time reformatting it to get to a bunch of different places around the world in a bunch of different formats. And then I'm spending way too much time checking that the calculation that was done by my provider is actually based on the inputs I sent.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount of manual effort going into this. I think some people I talk to would say maybe 60 to 70% of people's time. So is in payroll is going into that kind of work, right? So I think to kind of get to that place where you can apply the models for machine learning, etc., we really got to have the pipes hooked up really well for data movement, and that then enables us to listen to that data at significant quantities, to do some of the things that Thomas spoke about, which is to kind of reverse engineer what the rules are based on those data flows. But I think if I'm in a payroll role and I've a 6, 12, 18, 24 months challenge in front of me, say, look, what's the one thing, if I could have a want, what's the one thing I'd make go away? I think it's that very basic plumbing layer of getting data from A to B back and the checking associated with that. So I think we're without a doubt on a very exciting kind of trajectory towards some very exciting technologies. But in the short run, until they arrive, solving that connectivity piece and solving that checking piece, I think, is something that is probably in front time horizon in front of us.
Yeah, I think, look, in this, we always underestimate change in the short term. We overestimate in the short term and underestimate in the long term. But in the next, I'd say that there's 2 projects I would concern, if I was a payroll function now, that I'd concern myself. One is improving the processes around data input, right? What can we do to improve validation, automate as much as we can that input process into payroll? And the second thing I look to do is how can we improve the employee satisfaction in terms of automating and improving the communication to the employee about what they've been paid, when they've been paid. And, I keep going back to the, when I talk about employee engagement, a lot of that's been driven from a talent management agenda, but actually for a lot of people, the most engaging moment in my month is when I receive my payslip.
I think especially at the moment, Thomas, with the cost of living crisis, right?
So for most people, actually, the way that we communicate pay is, it's not, I'm a bit of a geek on payroll history, and I can go back and take you back to 1951 to Leo 2 and talk about the first payroll. But if you look at the payslip that popped out of probably not the first payroll, but probably the one 10 years later, and you compare it to the modern payslip, they look pretty similar. They're riddled with codes. They're completely unintelligible to anybody except a payroll person. And how we actually communicate the output of the payroll to the employees is pretty dismal. And I think as a function, we could do a lot better. The payroll combination to payroll and HR could do a lot better at communicating to the employee what they've been paid and why it is calculated in the way that it is. I think the opportunity to improve service automation around employee, about when employees have issues with the payroll, the service desk tooling, the workflow tooling, the chat capabilities. I think there's a lot of innovation that's available today in employee service and in customer service that can be applied. That can be applied to payroll service. So if I was looking for a quick win, I'd probably look at that. I'd probably look at that input question, and I'd probably look at the issue resolution, the technologies not in the payroll itself, but that surround the payroll for the issue resolution and for the worker communication, especially frontline workers. I think there's been a lot of innovation in terms of the communications tools to frontline workers, and I think the payslip and the pay information is a fundamental part of that. So, I'd be urging people, especially that have lots of frontline and remote workers, is to focus on how you're communicating payroll results and what channels and automation you're providing to help employees improve their, help payroll departments improve their responsiveness to employee concerns and issues. Oh, my overtime's wrong. This is wrong. That's wrong. How do you actually? What processes do you put in place to make that better? And the improvements in those technologies, let's take them from customer service and from other places that have been successful in improving those processes, and apply them to the payroll as a service offering function. But the disruption of the core fundamental payroll engine is coming. Whether it's a year away, whether it's 2 years away, whether it's 5 years away, it is completely weird that we have a system responsible for trillions and trillions of euros a year going through our organizations, and we are essentially using technologies that are 30 years old. And
why do you think that
at some point has to change?
But just on that point, I mean, you made some very good points and brought some good examples about, just as basic as the pay slip, right? Over the last 60, 70 years since the first sort of automated printed pay slips have come into existence, it hasn't really evolved dramatically from then, right? And other things as well, right? We talk about the payroll engines that still run on, very, very old technology. Why do you think that is? And is there something that's changing that the payroll industry in some areas maybe has certainly come a long way, but in other areas it just seems like it's incredibly resistant to evolve or change?
Sure. Look, the payroll is by definition, like, it's a zero-sum thing, right? It's a binary. You don't get a prize for payroll being 110%. You get it's 100% or it's wrong. There's no upside. So people have been reluctant to change payrolls, and vendors have been reluctant to innovate on new technologies, because the problem is that you have to have quite a high level unlike many other areas of technology, you have to have quite a level of function feature fit before you can release something, right? So you can't say, well, actually, we've only built deductions. We haven't built earnings yet and rolled it out. It doesn't work. You've got to have, you've kind of got to get it to a point. But we have seen new payrolls come. Most of the innovation has been in SME. You look in the US at things like Gusto. You look at PayFit in France. There have been new payroll engines emerging and being successful. I think the work they've been doing a lot with their payroll engine, which I think is interesting. This new one coming. My former employee have been plotting one for since I was a boy. And there's a swell coming, and part of what will happen is that and these things don't happen on a gradual basis. There's like stays the same, changes. And when that change happens, it will happen with a flood, right? Because what comes next will be so much better that people will want to change. At the moment, people don't know what that future is, and so they're scared or they're cautious. And why should I change? And we're seeing also from a VC point of view, we're seeing money being pumped into especially in the SME solutions. You look at we're an investor in Oyster, and that's performed brilliantly for us as an investment. Others, deals. If you look at deals revenue from this year, there's stuff happening. The innovation's happening in SME at the moment, not happening in enterprise, but it's going to start. It's going to start coming. It's only really a matter of matter of time.
Mm-hmm. In terms of one thing I wanted to pick up on there as well is sort of you talked about things being sort of held back by risk aversity and so on. Of course, you got to get it right in payroll. 100% of the time, you can get it sort of half right. But it's also about how much support and buy-in you get, not just out of the payroll part of the organization, but people that hold the purse strings and need to come on board and say, yep, this is an important area and we'll invest in it. And I think historically, from what I've seen, that has also been challenging in many organizations to get people that ultimately will sign off on the checks that need to be written to buy in and become supportive and say, we got to make a change here, right? Because there's that mindset, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And we'll just meddle through it until it really falls apart. Do you see that changing? And do you believe that's maybe going all the way back to the pandemic? Is that sort of helping us to become more aggressive, more assertive? Is it helping elevate payroll to become a bigger, important topic in the corporate hierarchy to get support for these kind of innovation initiatives? Maybe starting with Anita.
I think where you see initiatives is mostly in gathering the data from the various local payrolls and bring them to a global level. So analytics, insights, dashboards, those types of projects have a clear case. Mm-hmm. They aren't putting any risks on your underlying payroll. It's just a lot of work sometimes to figure out how to compare apples to apples, and then have companies like yourselves come in to help companies get a handle on that with deep understanding of what is going on in the countries, and hopefully providing them some background in analytics on overtime and benefits and all of that. That is typically it's foreign language to the C-suite, simply because what some countries do or allow you to do is very complex. And I think those projects have been funded, but the problem with payroll is that there is hardly ever a business case. In all the time that I have been there, there is usually a business case when you come from nothing and everything is manual and you need to automate and you bring it into a system, then you have a business case.
Mhm.
But the business case from switching from one provider to another is usually not there. That means that when you have to come up at board level and defend why we are doing this, someone from another department with a better ROI is going to get all the attention, and we're going to do that. And if it's not burning, then we'll leave payroll as it is and everyone will be happy. What I think is now changing is that we are working with employees who demand more. And that was a change that was already underway. But things like, if people are leaving because you cannot pay them today, but your competitor can, then you have a compelling reason to bring up a business case and say, hey, our payroll systems are not as modern as we would like them to be. Just as an example, right? And so I think employee behavior will start to drive much more innovation in this space than potentially payroll administrators could get on their own by simply showing a business case and saying, hey, we need something new because our technology isn't cutting it anymore.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a risk dimension to this, so that if the payroll technology is getting very old and is hard to maintain, and is hard to adapt to legislative changes, right? Then that starts to create a risk component, and that risk builds slowly. But some of the payrolls that have been around for a long time are starting to become very cumbersome to adapt to legal changes. So you take examples like perhaps go back a few years in the UK, the delivery of RTI for some vendors, for some companies that was a complete nightmare. For others it was relatively easy, and we will see more and more of those changes being driven by legislative requirements. So as governments see that, so there's a close correlation between technology enhancement and the ability of governments to tax us in new ways. And so as there are innovations in technology, there will be new demands for new forms of taxation and new ways of collecting tax. And as those come, those will force innovation in payrolls, and the payrolls that are older and harder to change may not be able to cope with those new legislative requirements. We had examples in France a few years ago, when they introduced a form of PAYE. Basically, many of the older vendors weren't able to cope with that change, and that's why PayFit became so successful. One of the reasons why PayFit became so successful in France is they're able to leverage that legislative change. So when there's a major legislative change that really impacts the payroll, then that will help drive a replacement cycle of those underlying technologies. But I think the main driver is exactly what Anita will say. It'll be in places like retail, where real-time pay becomes a significant differentiator. So if you're working at Starbucks or at Costa Coffee, as a part-time casual student barista, your favorite band are playing next weekend, and so you go on Thursday, you work an extra shift, and you need to buy your ticket, and so you walk out the door after the end of your shift, and within 15 seconds of walking out the door from your shift, the money's in your bank account. That's differentiating from the other company where you have to wait a week. And it's technically feasible to do payroll. It will be technically feasible to do payroll almost instantaneously. And yes, there's reconciliations with taxes and all the rest of it, but it's not, we're not far away from being able to do that for the employees that want it. And so in places like retail, that will be like hugely hugely impactful. Perhaps nurses, perhaps some of those places. It'll be hugely impactful for those people to have that. I think other areas where impact's going to come is when we start to see offerings where you can bring the current account and the pay slip and the payroll come together, right? And that starts to get really, really interesting, because if I'm a bank and I can get the mortgage payment instantaneously off the pay slip, then I'm prepared to give you, theoretically, I'll be prepared to give you better terms than if I'm waiting. I've got to wait for it to go through into your current account first. And I think there'll be a whole lot of disruption. That's where
analytics, right? If you
going to come from the pay, is that the bank, so your payroll and your current account start to merge. The question for me is, who wins? Is it a payroll vendor that becomes my current account, or is it a current account vendor that becomes my payroll? And if I look forward a few years, that's going to get really, really interesting.
Well, if we look back, Thomas, in the UK, I think in about 2010, the BACS organization were really pushing for payroll calculation to be done within the banking system based on gross pay being pushed at them for those very reasons. Yeah, there's a number of white papers circulated in Parliament trying to. But
if we look,
you already have that in the UK, because you have Revolut, and Revolut has a payroll and is a bank. And so, in principle,
have they actually got the payroll now? Because I saw a job advert about 2 years ago for payroll, and then I heard silence.
Yeah.
But they're
offering payroll, yes. And so potentially that means that the money never has to leave the bank between the employer and the employee. And of course, they do different things with it. But just imagine how much insight a bank could potentially have.
Well, better opportunities to get better loans, better rates,
Exactly.
But you've things like PSD2 as well, which from a banking perspective give you insights into people's behaviors, which allow tailored products. But if the first institution that gets hold of calculates my pay gets first dibs on taking their repayment, it completely changes the risk profile of the bank towards delivering those products to consumers. And hopefully, in those circumstances, the consumer also gets a better deal out of it, right? You get more. Yeah.
No. But just think about the early warning for a consumer, where you say, hey, you realize, you're heading into overdraft. Wouldn't you like to move some money from your payroll? Let's pay this off before you get into overdraft. I think the opportunities to do interesting, or the savings opportunities. The one that fascinates me is, or something that fascinates me is, for most people think about their net pay, right? That's what you get, right? Your net pay, right? And for most people, that's the biggest that's their only income in a given month, is their net pay. So if you're planning to go on holiday, right, you're sitting down with your spouse, and you're saying, okay, geez, we want to go to Tenerife or wherever, Blackpool or wherever it is you were going on holidays, and you say, okay, well, we need to save £1,200 or €1,200 to go on holiday, and we want to buy the airplane tickets, we want to book the hotel or whatever it is. And so you say, how much overtime do I need to do to save an extra £900? Now that's what the employee wants to know. The employee wants to know, what do I need to do to get that extra £900? Not, what's the gross salary. They want to know what's the net that's going to land in the bank account. And if you can ask, if HR systems and payroll systems can answer that sort of question, that's super valuable to an employee, right? And we don't answer those questions today, because to calculate the payroll, because you need the payroll, you need to run a payroll to answer that question. Now, if the payroll is running all the time, or as an employee, I can simulate my payroll whenever I want. That's super powerful. I can simulate my own payroll as an employee. I can run the payroll. I'm sitting at home and say, well, what happened if I got a 10% increase? And I run it and I can run that myself. Oh, well, it ends up being that. Or what happens if I took put more money into my ISA and into my savings? What would the impact be on my net? And being able to do that as an employee, I think will be the financial planning opportunities of bringing payroll and finance together is super interesting. But we're not, the potential is just around the corner, I feel.
Yeah. No, look, it's super exciting times, and I think there's lots of these kind of opportunities that we've talked about, over the last hour that are coming our way. I'm looking at the time. We've already gone a little bit over the hour here that we set aside, and it just shows that it's a topic that we could probably spend 3-4 hours on and still not get to cover all the interesting different angles and dimensions. I'll say for myself, my head is buzzing after this conversation. So it's not from drinking wine over here in Europe. It's already a little late. But I think this is a fantastic conversation. Maybe we'll do a follow-up session, especially if Anita and Thomas are up for it. Might dive into some of the areas that we started to touch on a little further. But I want to make sure we give people their time because some people are trying to get home for dinner or need to run to their next meetings. Any final thoughts? Just going around the table here. Any last closing thoughts on where is payroll headed? We've touched so many things already, but if you have sort of a couple closing comments, that'd be great. We'll go Thomas, and then Trevor, and then Anita.
No, just payroll's always going to be difficult, and massive respect to the people that run payrolls every day. It's not just about the technology; it's also about the people that do the work. And so, to all the payroll people on the call, thank you very much.
Well said. Yeah, with all the innovation technology, someone still has to get it done. Trevor?
I suppose let's focus on some real problems that can improve how people work is really the driver for me. So if we can save people time and through innovation help create a more fulfilling work environment for everyone, I think that's something that technology vendors like ourselves should really take on board and drive forward.
Perfect. Keeping it real. Anita?
Sure. I think there's tremendous potential in payroll. And one of the things that I think we should be more aware of as people who work in the industry is that for our customers, the employees, a payslip is just the beginning, right? It allows them to do a host of different things. And while we have, I think for the past 20 years, been very focused on optimizing payroll for ourselves, for our companies, we haven't focused that much on optimizing payroll for the people who we pay. And so I just sent out my newsletter earlier today, and the title actually was "A Payslip is Just the Beginning." And I think we should think a little bit more outside of our process and what we are actually helping people to accomplish or allowing them to do with what goes on inside of payroll. So that would be my my message.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, bring it back to who's actually the ultimate audience and the ultimate customer. Start with the end in mind. Fantastic. Listen, this was as I expected, thoroughly enjoyable and fascinating conversation. I've seen a lot of excited comments here in the chat as well, so people definitely resonate with the conversation, and definitely a lot more than we can cover in this format in 1 hour. But as I said, maybe we'll get a chance to set up another session and explore some other angles as well. At this point, I want to thank the panelists, Anita, Thomas, Trevor. Great having you on. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your perspective. And thank you everyone for joining us in this session today. We will, come back to you very shortly. And as we mentioned at the beginning, session has been recorded, so also look out for the posting of the recording as well. So thank you so much, everyone. And
well, thank you for having us on the show.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
absolutely. Great having you. And talk to you all very soon.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Take care.
Bye.